pretty lousy conditions to a place where people are prospering. It takes a kind of freedom, it takes a level of commitment by the policy entrepreneurs to develop a supporting environment for the private sector, which then can drive the economic growth that allows people to flourish. So the title of the talk was Entrepreneurs, a Missing Piece of the Puzzle. Until Bill Easterly, nobody was talking about entrepreneurs in the development literature. We were talking about the need to inject funds into systems. We were talking about technological challenges. We were talking about education. But we weren't talking about entrepreneurs. We weren't talking about the people who were seeking solutions for a host of problems. These are the people who are driving positive change on the ground, though, in Africa. They may come from the government. They may be policy entrepreneurs. Most of them are going to come from the private sector, though. The ones who are in the public sector, here's what they need to do in order to get their folks to do more and do better. You got to feel safe. If you don't feel safe, you tend not to invest. You tend not to grow businesses. It's very hard to do that. And you have to continue to expand market opportunities. You can do that by reducing some more of those tariffs I was talking about, making it easier for people to trade not only within the domestic environment, but to trade regionally and then globally. But these are the people who make poverty history. It's not so much the folks who are working at the IMF, many of whom are really smart and have good intentions. These are the people who make poverty history. They're the people who develop the businesses. They're the people who create the space for business to develop. These are the people who really need to be at the center of the development debate, and unfortunately, until recently, they haven't been. Fortunately, now they are. So I think we have, I've run a little bit on the late side, but we have time for questions, and I would be really happy to entertain your questions.
Let's first thank Professor Boudreaux. So a few questions.
Yes, of course. I'm sorry.
You brought the example of Namibia where the government gave out a certain natural resource license to local communities, and local communities were able to use that to increase their wealth. To me, just from the outside, without knowing the particulars, it would seem that should have run into the Dutch disease, which is generally when a government bases its wealth off of natural resource exploitation. For instance, in Holland in the 50s and the 60s, per capita income actually decreased after the discovery of North Sea oil. So what was the difference in Namibia, and why in Namibia, what explanation are they given, why did Namibia run into the Dutch disease?
So in Dutch disease scenarios, there's usually, you've discovered some very valuable natural resource, typically oil, right? Or it could be gold or something like that. And then there's the currency problem of the Dutch disease. So once you start producing this very valuable thing, you're selling a bunch of it, a lot of money's coming into the country, and that's creating currency problems at home. But there's also the problem of the government then focuses on that sector of the economy to the exclusion of other sectors. So other sectors are kind of ignored. And all the attention is put on the oil sector. So for two reasons, I think this is not the same as the case in Namibia. I should also probably say that you guys know that in virtually everywhere in the world, other than the United States, all subsurface wealth is owned by the government, right? So in Norway, in Nigeria, the people who own the oil is the Nigerian government or the Norwegian government. It's not you who might happen to have oil in your backyard, which is different from here. Why do we not have a natural resource curse in the United States?
Well,
A small part might be that the ownership is hugely decentralized over those resources, tends to be. So I think the difference in Namibia is we're not talking about anything like the scale of income that you get from oil sales. So I think the currency issues are just don't happen. Number two, because it's the local people have actually been given a pretty robust property right. It's not even a license. They have the legal right now to manage the wildlife and benefit from the use of the wildlife. So I think there's a lot of decentralized experimentation going on about what's the best way to deal with the wildlife, what's the best management plan, how do we best take care of the wildlife that's migratory, moving on my property sometimes, it's on your property other times. And I think that local people have been very resourceful and very creative, very much in an experimental frame of mind about how to deal with that resource. And that kind of decentralized experimentation you tend also not to see in the resource case examples. So the scale is just dramatically different. And because the ownership is decentralized among these communities, I think you're seeing experimentation that's helping to promote varied entrepreneurship. So in other words, not all attention is focused on just one way to deal with the wildlife. You're seeing a lot of entrepreneurial activities related to conservancies. So people are building a host of businesses. They're building internet cafes, they're building bakeries, they're building mechanic shops to deal with tourists who are coming in. So they themselves are figuring out that they need to not have all their eggs in one basket. So diversifying income surrounding the wildlife. That may be part of it. There may be other explanations, but it definitely has not been a resource curse for Namibia.
Do you think decentralized ownership can be a roadmap for other big resource funds?
Yeah, I'm always saying this, and people are always poo-pooing it. So something like the Alaska Permanent Fund is probably... Did you talk about this with Collier? Too bad. And did you read Collier's latest book, or did you read The Bottom Billion?
We read The Bottom Billion.
Okay. If you read Paul Collier's latest book, he says that the natural mineral wealth of the world should be owned by the governments because no one should own it. I think that's exactly wrong. I think it would be put to better use. It would be used in a wiser way, and local communities would benefit more if local communities had more of a legal stake in the management of those resources. So you could do something like create a permanent fund, which is what Alaska has, or Norway's sovereign fund. Ghana's trying to create something like Norway's sovereign fund. I think it would be even better, though, if local communities had something like an ownership stake over the resources under their ground.
What would be a permanent fund?
But why don't we get some other questions? There are probably other people because you guys want to get some.
Yeah, we can talk about that at dinner. Yes,
Good question.
Dan.
You mentioned that one of the keys to more widespread prosperity was not just business, but growth of business. So is there venture capital and other funds coming into the country?
There are. Increasingly, there is venture capital going into Africa. There's a lot more private foreign direct investment, private investment going into Africa. In 2000, there was about $9 billion in foreign direct investment in Africa. In 2009, there was about $62 billion of private foreign direct investment, and that's not counting other sorts of capital, private capital that's flowing in that's not foreign direct investment, so lending to African companies. Yeah, I mean, one of the problems has been it's not been seen as either it's been seen as too risky for a variety of really good reasons, and there hasn't been a lot of medium to large scale entrepreneurship on the ground in Africa. So there's like a whole missing middle argument. There aren't middle-sized companies. There are a few big companies and a lot of small companies. Part of the reason why there's not a lot of middle-sized companies might be that there's not a lot of access to credit, or there's not a lot of access to the technology that lets you grow. So increasingly that's changing. Yes, sir?
You mentioned how there are cases where governments decide to change policy or property rights, and then that encourages entrepreneurs to engage in more activity. It seems like it would be more likely, but have there been more unlikely, but have there been examples where there's an entrepreneurial spirit or activities that people engage in, and then the government decides to change its policies because they see that it's in their interest, and that's better for the people? Or is that hasn't happened?
I can give you maybe one direct example and one indirect example. So here's a really interesting direct example. The country of Niger, which is in the Sahel region.
Could you just move that to the bottom of the screen and we'll pop up?
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So the country of Niger, which is this country right here. So like the Sahara Desert's running across here, right? This is a country that's very poor, and the desert is expanding. It's constantly pushing south in this country, and that creates all sorts of problems for people because what can you do with the desert? Lo and behold, the government realized about 2 years ago, because it was looking at Google Earth is important in this regard. It realized, wow, down here, instead of being all brown, it was starting to look all green. So what was accounting for the difference? Where the government hadn't expected to see a big swath of green in the country, but satellite imagery is saying, oh, there's a whole bunch of green in the country where we didn't expect it. What had happened was, Niger is a former French colony, and in former French colonies, the government owns the trees. because trees tend to be valuable resources. You can either cut the branches to use for firewood, or they may be producing things like cocoa or palm seeds that can be turned into palm oil. So the government wants to control the trees. That was the case in Niger. The law said the government owned all the trees. But the government didn't have enough people on the ground to monitor that particular law. So it had a law, but it couldn't enforce the law. So what happened to all the trees? Well, they were going away. Like, this is part of the explanation for why the desert's encroaching throughout the country. It's because people aren't protecting the trees anymore because they don't own the trees. So farmers made a voluntary decision a decade ago amongst themselves, and it just apparently started with a few farmers. We said, okay, we guys are going to go back to our example. We said, you know what, I won't cut down your tree if you don't cut down the tree that's in my field. And so this informal arrangement to protect property rights over trees spread across the southern part of Niger to the point where farmers just ignored the law that was on the books and said, we know we need trees, our soil's dying, we're losing our livelihoods, we want to stay in our country. Maybe if we keep the trees, maybe that'll help the soil stay in place and we'll actually be able to earn an income and a livelihood. Actually, after the government realized what the farmers had done amongst themselves, the government said, okay, we give up. You guys can have individualized rights to the trees on your land. As long as the tree's on your land, you can have it. That's kind of a nice example of a bottom-up legal change that the government recognizes. Another change, though, might be a country like, to a certain extent, a country like Mauritius. I don't know. We should just close it, probably. Mauritius is considered to be maybe the best economic success story in sub-Saharan Africa today. It's an interesting example. It's a country that's like way out. This is it over here, this little dot. This is Mauritius. So it's a tiny little island nation, very heterogeneous. The majority population is Hindu, folks who had been brought in as indentured servants to work in sugarcane fields. There's a small number of Franco-Mauritians who had been the colonists, and then there's some black Africans who had also been brought over as laborers to work in the sugarcane plantations. It's a very entrepreneurial society, though. Like a lot of Indians who leave India and go to other parts of the world, there seems to be a strong entrepreneurial ethos among the Indians who are in Mauritius. And so this is a country that's really made it government policy to promote the entrepreneurial culture. And they've been very good at it, actually. You know, why have they been good when Malawi has not been good? Maybe maybe culture is part of the answer.
One more question?
Yes, sir?
Do NGOs ever incentivize the policymakers to move away from the suboptimal situation? Where they'll actually take people like they're sort of creating policy and entrepreneurship, and they play a big role in the private sector.
You know, one way to tell the story of why has Africa changed over the past 10 years would be to tell the following story. You know, depending upon how familiar you are with development, this will make sense or not. In the 1980s and the 1990s in particular, big, giant multilateral and lending agencies like the IMF and the World Bank would provide loans to African countries with conditions, especially the IMF. It's called conditionality. And the conditions were normally, okay, we'll give you some money, but you better change your policies, and you better kind of like straighten up your house. So we want you to privatize companies that were state-owned. We want you to lower your inflation rates. In other words, get your monetary policy under control. We want you to clean up your macroeconomic environment. This was this conditionality for lending was not NGOs, but it was the multilateral lenders saying to countries, we want you to do something different. It's been largely criticized, conditionality, because in some cases conditionality required things like, we want you to get rid of subsidies for rice. So the price of rice shot up, and that had a real impact on poor people in countries. But the IMF would oftentimes say, we want your prices to float, we want prices to be free and fair in your country. In other words, reflect the market. But maybe conditionality is what's really important, actually, in the long term for Africa's success. By imposing some kind of macroeconomic discipline on these countries,